Hi, welcome to Tales of Dread. In this episode we have some true horror stories of people who went camping and experienced their own creepypasta. Growing up in Dallas with my friends, camping was not something we did on purpose. Why would you go out into the wilderness to fight insects? The entire premise seemed absurd. It wasn't until I left for college that I realized how much fun I had during my 4 years at North Texas. I'd go from die-hard city boy to borderline survivalist in an instant, then something happened that ruined my love of the woods to this day. As I mentioned at the outset, I was never a fan of the outdoors before moving to Denton. I'd always seemed to run into a spider web if there was one. If the mosquitoes were hungry, they'd come after me. You get the picture. I ended up rooming with his kid from around Nacogdoches by chance. He'd spent his childhood in the woods. A few of his friends from back home were with us at North Texas. During our vacations, they would camp all over the state. They invited me to Lake Ray Roberts as my first spring break approached. If you didn't already know, this well-known lake near Denton is Ray Roberts. It is famous throughout the world for its bass fishing, among other things. I wasn't looking forward to hanging out in Dallas, and I didn't know any of the cool kids who were on their way to the coast. So, Ray Roberts, you had no prior camping experience. I had to rely on the advice of my companions. Everything I needed I borrowed, bargained for, or improvised, and the only thing I didn't skimp on was bug spray and deep woods off, and I would become intimate friends. On that trip, something incredible would happen. I was able to concentrate on the actual experience because I had covered myself in bug spray. Everything was going swimmingly. Then I hooked my first fish and was hooked for life. The rest of that trip was spent learning everything I could about nature. After that adventure, I made it a point to join every trip for the next 2 years. That summer, when I wasn't in class or sleeping, I walked from one end of town to the other and got to see the ocean. Despite its university status, Denton retains a small-town atmosphere. There wasn't a single tree or animal track. During the warmer months, I was unable to identify. I spend as much time as I can at nearby Louisville Lake practicing my newly acquired skill. My East Texas friends didn't seem to know half as much as I did. My friends in Dallas said they didn't recognize me after a while. But I didn't mind. I vowed never to be separated from nature again, and in some ways, I'm still deeply connected to it. But when it comes to stepping back into the woods, I may never be able to do so again. By the end of my final year, it was spring break, and some of my fellow campers had dropped out or transferred. We kept in touch with 1 or 2 of the guys who were still around. I've been planning a large trip to a well-known national forest in the state's east. I'd rather not mention it here. I'm afraid my experience will put some people off visiting the area. It's truly beautiful, regardless of what shady things are going on there, and I was warned to be wary of overzealous hunters before leaving. This trip, on the other hand, would not take place during any hunting season that I was aware of, so I felt relatively safe. After one last quick scan of my checklist, I jumped in my Jeep and began a 3+ hour drive. I arrived at my camping spot shortly after 3 p.m. and set up everything exactly how I wanted it. Before dinner, I decided to take a quick look around. This was my first encounter with them. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling that I was being watched never left me. I ended my hike and returned to camp. Although bears were not known to inhabit this region, I'd read a few stories online, and the prospect of being eaten on my first day there sounded terrifying. I ate dinner and went to bed shortly after dark. Nothing out of the ordinary happened that night, and the next morning was something out of a fantasy, as far as I know. The air was the freshest I'd ever inhaled. Breakfast had to be quick and simple. I can't remember what it was, and you'll see why shortly. The beauty of the morning enticed me to go exploring. I hit the trail with a small day pack containing all of my emergency supplies and some food. The next few hours were peaceful. The occasional snapped twig or shuffling sound could be heard, but I never had the impression that anyone other than myself and the animals were present. I stopped for a snack shortly after 11 am and lounged lazily against a pine tree while waiting for my tran jar to heat up some water. I must have been dozing off when a particularly brave mosquito sank her fangs into my neck. I jerked awake and swatted the little pest into a red smudge when I noticed a flash in the distance. It was only a quick movement, and I briefly questioned my vision. However, the loud calling of a crow soon after told me I wasn't alone, even though I wasn't scared. I was perplexed as to why anyone would be watching me. You can imagine how creepy that would be. The crow eventually flew away, leaving me alone to enjoy my coffee. If my creepy stalker hadn't already shown himself, he most likely had no malicious intent toward me. I stayed there for about 10 minutes before packing up and leaving. After about a half hour, it became clear that my stalker was still with me. He also didn't seem to understand the importance of remaining silent in the woods. Behind me, a constant, distant sound of shuffling leaves could be heard. A strange odor began to drift ahead of me. When I cut to sniff the air, the woods fell silent. A shiver ran through me. Something was wrong. Curiosity got the best of me, and I started walking in the direction of the smell, against my instincts. I had only taken 3 steps when a puff of dirt and needles appeared next to me. A crack appeared behind me not a second later. I turned to find the source. Perfect timing for another crack. This is when I realized I was being shot at and fell to the ground. I didn't dare to move now that I was frozen in place. I kept an eye out for any movement. The internet's warnings about overzealous hunters began to reverberate in my head. I reasoned that if I yelled, the shooter may realize his error and decide to hold his fire. I did exactly that, but no response came. I assumed I was safe because I couldn't hear any movement. The sounds of the forest gradually returned. This was the confirmation I required. I was shaken, but not damaged. I get back to my feet and brush myself off as the strange odor hits me again. I hadn't learned my lesson yet, so I started walking toward it. Another quick series of shots came from the direction of the smell within about 5 steps. I couldn't think of a reason. I simply turned around and ran back in the direction I had come from. My sole goal was to return to civilization alive. I begged God to deliver me from this situation over and over again. 1 or 2 more shots rang out behind me, but I was too preoccupied with getting away to notice where they landed. My flight lasted at least 10 minutes. I didn't stop until my body gave out. I couldn't stay where I was because I hadn't heard any shots in a long time. I chugged a canteen of water and resumed my escape, albeit at a much slower pace. I was back at my camp within an hour. I just wanted to get back to Denton as soon as possible. There was no time wasted in properly packing anything. I didn't even bother to make sure the fire was completely out. A crime I would never have committed otherwise because I had no intention of informing the authorities. My greatest fear was being forced to return to the scene of the crime. This thought made me gag. Nonetheless, the further I got away from the national forest, the more guilty I felt because there was a very real chance that another camper would stumble into whatever I had. I knew I couldn't bear the guilt of a preventable death on my conscience. I finally found the police station about 20 miles from the national forest and filed a report. The officer did not appear surprised by what he had heard. He proposed the overzealous hunter theory, but after some thought, it didn't fit when the shooting stopped when I identified myself. That makes sense. The truth is that I had no idea what had occurred. The officer promised to look into it, and for a brief moment I thought he was going to ask me to show the officers the exact location, but he abruptly stopped and thanked me for coming in. I had no hope. To be honest, I didn't care if the cops found anything, let alone contacted me. I had no intention of ever returning to that location. I must have appeared to be a complete moron kissing the ground outside my house. But the relief I felt was priceless. After some time had passed, things began to return to normal. Despite the terrifying experience, I had every intention of returning to the woods. But not in those woods. I came to a halt at the 4channel/outboard after noticing a particularly pertinent post. The O.P. had been hiking in an area he thought he knew well. For years, stories about massive pot fields guarded by cartel members had circulated, but he dismissed them as fear-mongering. Then, by chance, he came across one of those mythical growing patches where he hadn't heard or seen anyone. He hoped to slip away unnoticed. And as soon as he started backing up, gunfire erupted all around him. He was grazed on the inside of his cheek as he ran back toward his house. He was too terrified to report the entire incident. In fact, the story seemed a little too convenient for me, but the seed had already been planted in my mind. Something like this never occurred to me as a possibility. It didn't matter whether it was true or not in my case. The longer I stayed away from the woods, the more real it became until I finally accepted it. My days in the woods had lasted more than 9 years. Life is much the same as it was before I went to college. The only difference is that they are older and far more knowledgeable about the natural world. I occasionally find myself staring out into the woods near my house, feeling the same call to the wild that I once did. But it will never be the same. I'm well aware that the chances of something like that happening are extremely low. It's not fear that's driving my avoidance, at least not all these years later, now that I know things like that are happening in the woods, a place I still adore. I can't see them as clearly as I used to. They're tainted for me. They are poisoning the forest, and the wildlife that live there. My very existence has been permanently imprinted on my mind. No, I'm content with my memories and sharing my knowledge with those who seek it. I prefer to recall things as they once were, crisp, clean, and lovely. In the late spring of 2017, I set out on a long-awaited camping trip out west. The trip had been planned for nearly 2 years and would be my first opportunity to camp with firearms. The trip to the location was enjoyable, and I learned a lot about that part of our country that I was previously unaware of. When I arrived, I parked my truck and notified my contact that I was safe. We went over my itinerary one last time before I started the long hike to my campsite. The first day passed quietly because the weather was so pleasant. I slept beneath the stars, next to my campfire. In comparison to all the restrictions we had back home, the freedom I felt was refreshing. The next day was similar to the previous one in that I walked at a leisurely pace and enjoyed all the wildlife around me. A little after 1 p.m. I finally found the spot where I wanted to camp. A quick scan revealed that I'd made an excellent decision. Everything was in place, and I was preparing my lunch. I could feel myself nodding off after that, so I decided to do some shooting after all. That's why I came out here. About 200 yards from the camp, I discovered a dry creek bed. It appeared to be the most secure location for shooting. I positioned a few steel targets and let the lead fly. I can't put into words how happy I was. I felt. This had to be how the mountain men lived. I told myself that I had finished a box of 762 and was reloading my SKs. When the sound of gunshots rang out in the hills around me, curiosity drove me to investigate their source. As I search, the shots continue. They sounded like they were fired from multiple guns. This made me a little nervous. I chose to return to camp, and something told me from the sound of the shots that I wouldn't be welcome, a decision I still regret and thank myself for to this day. I started thinking about what I was going to eat for dinner. The shooting had ceased shortly after I returned. I assumed the shooters had left and that the evening would be peaceful. I laid back and stared at the fire after I finished cleaning my guns, which took about an hour. I found myself nodding off once more. So, rather than making something substantial, I gorged myself on a sleeve of crackers and bacon-flavored, easy cheese. The sun was starting to set behind the trees, so I crawled off to bed for a good night's sleep. When a noise startled me awake, I jumped up and peered out of my tent. There was nothing there? I assumed it was a dream and went back to sleep, only to hear it again as I closed my eyes. A blood-curdling scream rang out throughout the night, following hearing a predator kill a rabbit. It was the most horrible sound I'd ever heard. The screams returned, but this time they were accompanied by a female voice pleading for help. Things became real at that point, and I felt a shiver run through my body. What did I intend to do? I considered grabbing my rifle and fleeing into the night. It was clear where the sounds were coming from by this point. The shots have been coming from earlier in the day. I ignored common sense and remained where I was. One more scream for assistance appeared, followed by a single gunshot, and I lay frozen in terror until the sun rose. My feelings of freedom and power vanished the next morning. Now I waited for the dawn to come so I could escape the approaching death. I had convinced myself that I would arrive with the sunrise. My child was packed in record time, and I was on my way back to a place I perceived as oppressive, or anywhere for that matter, but there a trip that had taken me a day and a half to make just a few days before took less than one. It was nothing short of miraculous. I'd make it back if I could. Every few minutes, I'd turn around, rifle tightly gripped in my hand, looking for some fictitious pursuers. I got back in my truck shortly after dark and headed home. Never happier to be back. After the relief had worn off, as far as I could tell, the guilt began to set in. I had heard a woman in need of assistance being murdered, and I did nothing about it for the entire drive back. My ego and common sense were at odds. I hated myself one second, calling myself a coward the next. You were clearly outnumbered. There is nothing you can do. All of those things are undeniably true, according to the facts. I was a coward, terrified as a child watching his first horror film, but running out into the pitch black after an unknown number of assailants would have been extremely stupid. To this day, the sting of my ego is the most intense. Any man, coward or hero, could tell you why. All of this was for naught. The real question was whether I should report what I'd seen, because that was a word that would undo my great act of virtue. I didn't see or hear anything. I heard a few screams and shots in the middle of nowhere, hardly a groundbreaking indictment in the absence of actual evidence. I'd be nothing more than a nuisance to the cops, and that would be the end of my punishment. It's this never-ending shame of preferring logic and reason over common decency. It would be months before I discovered the facts surrounding this incident, and I was terrified of what I would find. Nonetheless, when the time came for me to summon the courage to seek the truth, it turned out to be a mixed bag. To summarize, I happened to be camping a mile away from an outlaw biker gang. They had arrived earlier that day at the location where they had previously shot their illegal firearms. Sadly, they had also kidnapped a female backpacker. They released her after horrifyingly abusing her for several hours. She ran away from their campsite. This must have been the screams for help that I heard, only to be shot and left for dead most of the time, and this would be the end of the terrible story. The backpacker, however, clung to life by some miracle. Somehow? She returned to the highway and sought assistance. She was released from the hospital after a week. The bikers were aware that they had been apprehended and agreed to plea bargains that would result in the majority of them spending the rest of their lives in prison. Despite the fact that I was relieved to hear the victim was alive. I never told anyone about this incident because I was haunted by what-ifs to this day. I'm probably never going to use this disposable account. If you read this and think of me as a scumbag coward, I can't say I blame you. I didn't tell you this story for your benefit. Rather, this account is for those who believe it is best not to get involved in other people's problems. I can see why you want to avoid conflict. Many people have suffered as a result of doing the right thing. He could become one of those people. If you help someone in need, your life may be ruined as a result. From personal experience, I can tell you that it pales in comparison to the guilt you will carry with you for the rest of your life. It's straightforward. We're all here on this planet together. If we are able, we should assist our fellow humans in need. Put yourself in your neighbor's shoes. You might be the only thing standing between them and death. Despite the fact that the story is far from over. The majority of what I'll tell you happened about 12 years ago. It's 2009, and I'm still living with my parents. We moved into the neighborhood when I was 13 years old. Because of the bullying I experienced and the turmoil at home, I was forced to make the woods across the road my sanctuary not long after discovering them. This neighborhood didn't have many kids, and the few that did were older. Among other things, the hostility made me a nervous kid. I spent all of my free time alone. I wandered into the woods one day because I was curious. There didn't appear to be anyone else out there except me, which gave me a strange sense of safety, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I discovered a small circle of cedar trees that formed a secret open area, and turned it into a sort of clubhouse. As time went on, I found myself spending more and more time in the trees. I even fell asleep and spent the night out there once, expecting my parents to freak out, but they hadn't even noticed. This was all the justification I needed. Every now and then, I started camping in my clubhouse. I wasn't missed a single time at first. I was aware that I would require camping equipment. I tried bringing items from home, but they wore out quickly, and asking my parents for money was out of the question. I started going door to door offering my lawn mowing services. I'd never mowed a lawn before, but that didn't matter. The real issue was locating a lawnmower. I'd sneak out my father's mower and do some work. But I was eventually caught, and I took a beating as a result. Fortunately, I'd saved enough money by that point to buy a really bad one of my own. I used all of the money I'd saved, but it was a much safer way to make it. Once I was able to recoup my losses, I frequently rode my barely functional bike the 5 miles to this shabby army surplus store. I emerged with an Alice pack full of various items I thought I needed. I couldn't wait to put this stuff to the test. I skipped a week of school and stayed in my clubhouse. It was a fun hobby, but it was much more to me. For the next however many years I went to school just enough to avoid trouble. It was the only source of safety and happiness I had. Every afternoon, I'd walk straight from school to my clubhouse. I'd come to regard those woods as mine. In my mind, anyone in between was an invader, and when that day came, I didn't hesitate to strike back. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon. I'd been camping all weekend and was walking down to the creek to get some water. Across the stream, a 50-yard stretch of road was almost deserted. It was rarely seen in use. I came across a parked camper. The two men who walked in and out of it didn't seem to notice me. They were still there when I returned a few hours later. They were only now drinking beers and shooting guns mindlessly. This enraged me, but when a stray bullet struck the water just feet away, I had had enough. I ran the mile back home and dialed 911. I assumed my call was private. But now I'm not sure I made up a story about getting lost and driving up on the men. I lied and said they had threatened me with their guns, which I now realize was incorrect. But I was young and enraged at the time. As I was getting ready for school one morning, I overheard a news report about a large meth lab bust based on an anonymous tip. Deputies from the sheriff's office discovered two men shooting guns on a country road. Further investigation revealed that the camper the men were driving was a mobile meth lab. I knew this had to be the call when the two men were taken into custody and held pending bail hearings. I made. The gravity of the situation terrified me, but I was confident that no one would suspect that I had made the decision, and I even followed the case for the next year, up until 3 months before their sentencing hearing. I got an anonymous letter in the mail that simply stated, "You mess with the wrong people, kid." An icy cold fear shot through me. But I was still skeptical that it came from the two men. Any doubts I had were dispelled when another arrived the following week. This one is much clearer. You better hope we get our time served. I was too terrified to wonder how they knew it was me at the time. I'm still not sure how they found out who I was. But it didn't matter how. The letters kept coming in. When the hearing day arrived, the news was not good. Both men were felons who were discovered with multiple firearms. Add in the manufacturing charge and you get a minimum of 10 years in prison. The judge was not in a generous mood. He sentenced both men to 20 years in prison. I was convinced that my days on earth were numbered. I quit school and spent all of my time in the woods. I wasn't naive enough to believe it would keep me safe. But if I were to die, I wished to perish somewhere. I loved a strange thing happened despite the death I expected. Month after month, I grew more confident, and it had all been a joke or, more than likely, an intimidation tactic. My life has flown by, and the last 10 years have been a roller coaster ride. The meth heads were the furthest thing from my mind. Then, last week, a new anonymous letter arrived at my door. You should make a will. The conclusion is near. I unintentionally dropped it like a hot potato. My girlfriend was with me at the time and witnessed it. She picked up the letter and read it, and I could tell she was worried, but I pretended it was a joke and refused to explain, and then a ghost from my past reappeared in the present. You can probably guess what this unpleasant news did to me. Everywhere I go, I feel like I'm constantly looking over my shoulder. I'm scared to death. A newborn child going to the cops was a brief consideration, but without any proof of who the sender is, these monsters may go after my girlfriend. I understand there isn't much they can do. My options appear to be limited without anyone else to talk to, so I'm emailing this in anonymously to tell my story. I'm not sure why it could be because of the internet's anonymity. There isn't much else I can say except to warn you all to be cautious of the decisions you make as a child, to wish me luck, and to please pray for me and my family. This isn't knowledge. My wife and I only had this year. As soon as the quarantine was lifted in our area, she and I packed our packs and went for a hike at our local state park. It was something we used to do fairly frequently and had done since before we got married, and I was looking forward to it. The plan was to hike out to a specific lake, spend the night there, and then hike back to the car. It was a clear, warm day, and the trails were nice and dry for most of the morning. We decided to eat lunch at a campsite about halfway to the lake. Another couple must have had the same thought. We approached them as they sat at the concrete picnic table and invited them to join us. Soon, the four of us were debating what we had seen and where we were going. The couple turned out to be newlyweds on their honeymoon. My wife, who is a hopeless romantic, would love to hear this. She went on to tell them about how we met and other mushy details. I don't bother trying to remember. After 2 hours, we finally said our goodbyes. We arrived at the lake about an hour before dark, tired and hungry. I started a fire, and Mandy, my wife, prepared a small meal for us. We sat around the fire, cooking s'mores, and eventually called it a night. Around 10 p.m. the next morning, I woke just before dawn and prepared the fire for breakfast. We played out our roles from the night before, except I held the tent down and repacked it. We took every precaution to ensure that the fire was completely out after cooking, and then we hit the trail for the return trip. We arrived at the halfway point at 10 a.m. but decided not to stop for 2 hours. Strangely, his wife was not with him when he ran into the husband of the couple we met the day before. Mandy inquired about her whereabouts, and the man replied that she had become ill the night before and had returned home. When he said it, he looked nervous and couldn't look either of us in the eyes before either of us could ask another question. He explained that his wife had insisted on him finishing the journey alone. It sounded strange, but we had no reason not to believe him. At about the same time, a group of people approached, and the husband excused himself to speak with them. I wasn't interested in probing any further because their marriage was none of my business. I thought Mandy looked like she wanted to stay, but I reminded her of the obligations we had that night. We parted ways after she reluctantly agreed. We arrived at the parking lot not long after and began packing our belongings. As we pulled out of the lot, there were a few groups of people talking amongst themselves, and several more cars, including a ranger's truck, were pulling in. I didn't think much of it. We returned home that afternoon and took care of some family business. We didn't learn about the news until breakfast. I had gotten a cup of coffee and sat down in front of the television. When they showed her face on the screen, I almost choked on my coffee. It was a photograph of the woman we had just met 2 days before. I yelled for Mandy to join me in the living room. I wanted to be certain of what I was seeing. I didn't have my glasses on at the time, so I pointed to the television and asked, "Isn't that one of the newlyweds we met at the park?" She stood there for a moment, stunned, and let out a shocked gasp. Suddenly, a wedding photo of the couple appeared on the screen. According to the husband, Mandy grabbed the remote from my grip and turned up the volume. The couple had been on a cliff. That was a popular lookout, and Mandy and I had been there a few times before. They had watched the sunrise, and as they were about to turn and leave, the wife lost her footing and fell several hundred feet to the ground below. It was certainly possible. But something bothered me about it. Why hadn't he told us about it sooner? So, what was the deal with the illness story? It couldn't have been more than a few hours after the incident. Nothing he did made sense. I'm sure I'd be a wreck if something like that happened to me. We passed at least 15 people that morning, and not one of them spoke to us. It all seemed fishy to me. I was relieved to see that Mandy agreed with me. Just don't tell her her instincts had been correct once more. I stated that after a lengthy discussion about our responsibilities and the like, we agreed to contact the law enforcement involved in the case. And, as it stands, the husband is not under suspicion. Not publicly. Anyway, I called the sheriff's office, and told them what we knew. For a brief moment, the deputy put us on hold. When he returned, he mentioned that someone might contact us in the future. But it's been almost a year and no one has contacted us. This is why I'm emailing you. What do you think? My instincts and those of my wife indicate that a crime has occurred. We, on the other hand, have no proof or real justification for our feelings, and that's all they are. If law enforcement thought we had something to offer, they would have contacted us already. Right? I don't want to be an annoyance. I also don't want to cause problems for a bereaved man who appears to be a decent person. But please help me out here. Should I keep pushing or let the cops do their jobs? I just can't get rid of the nagging feeling that a man is getting away with cold-blooded murder. My childhood was anything but stable. Following their divorce, my father and mother dated a long string of losers. She even moved a few in and around 14. She married Frank, whom she met at the bar where she worked. Frank was a complete jerk who tried in vain to take over my father's role. Mom had done her best to keep Dad and me apart, but I had known the whole time. He adored me and desired to be with me. Prior to the divorce, he and I would frequently go fishing and camping. Listen to the love of the outdoors. I'll never shake, nor do I want to. This almost convinced me to live in the woods. I was 17 when I couldn't take Frank's tyranny any longer, despite the fact that I was an unemployed bum for the majority of the time. He expected me to wake up by 8 a.m. every day. Unlike him, I worked 5 days a week. I've been saving for my own place since my junior year. Getting away from him and my mother was so important to me that I dropped out of school at the end of my first semester and earned my GED. Dad was upset to hear about it, but he signed the waiver because he understood that on my days off, I felt I'd earned the right to sleep in. I was under a lot of pressure at work at the time, so when Frank came in yelling for me to wake up, I told him to F off. He drew back as if about to hit me, and I reacted by knocking him to the ground. This is the tipping point. I knew that little wimp would call the cops, so I packed my backpack as quickly as I could and hit the road, and I've never lived there again without a plan or a car. For the majority of the day, I wandered aimlessly. As the sun began to set, I crept into a wooded area on the outskirts of town. I walked in far enough to avoid being seen from the road and set up camp. I threw together a fire and made a bed out of clothes and leaves that night, which was surprisingly comfortable, but I had no intention of making it a long-term thing in my arrogant mind. I'd have no trouble finding an abandoned place to sleep until I had enough money. That was not the case. Most decent places had security. The one exception was a gang-controlled area. They used it as a shooting range. I felt like the floor was an inch thick and covered in old needles. Life with Frank was preferable to that. Another weekend was coming to an end. Sleep and safety were two of my top priorities. So I returned to my forest camp and made the best of what I had. Sleeping on the ground was not going to work in the long run. In the middle of that first week, I walked to a Walmart after work and bought a few items. A sleeping bag. Most importantly, a little time investment improved my sleeping arrangements significantly. I also constructed a simple lean-to structure out of a tarp that was lined with foil. The foil reflected the heat from the fire back down into my body, making the cooler nights much more bearable. For a long time, I would clean up as best I could in public restrooms. My clothes were cleaned at our 24-hour laundromat. It wasn't uncommon for me to spend the night there on laundry days. My hygiene drew a little attention from my bosses, but no one ever said anything, and I eventually found a fork in the river that ran near my camp. I'd bathe there as frequently as I could throughout my life. It was far better than it could have been had I not been employed. Not. Everything was as idealistic as I made it sound. Railroad tracks cut through my little patch of woods. Come hobos, and about a half-mile from my camp, across the track, was the hobos' camp. It wasn't much more than an overnight stop for most of those guys, and when I first discovered it by chance, I used the tracks as a quiet pathway back and forth each day. If the cops saw you walking along the busier roads, they'd stop you. This isn't something I wanted or needed. After all, I was still a minor. As I was returning to my campsite one evening, I noticed the glow of a fire reflecting off the leaves. As I approached it, I could hear a group of men conversing. I carefully peered down the hill and saw 3 older men huddled around the fire. I just stood there and listened for a few minutes. I eventually realized they weren't anyone to be concerned about and called down to them. They looked up and huddled together. They must have decided I wasn't a threat either. they summoned me down to join them. At first, I just sat there and listened to their stories, but after a while, they asked me my name and where I was going. I considered it for a moment before telling him that my name was Frank and that I lived nearby. This sparked an hour-long discussion about everything. I learned about rail travel, and told them about my situation. That night, I had my first taste of fortified wine. It's not something I'd recommend, but it grew on me. Nothing exciting would happen that night, or for a long time. The approach of fall seemed to bring with it the cold wind, but also a few ill-mannered hobos. I'd almost become a member of the train-hopping fraternity by this point. The few regulars and I had spent many a cool evening by the fire, listening to the newcomers' stories and passing around a bottle or two. An older gentleman named Tampo was among those passing through. He was quiet at first, but quickly became aggressive. The more intoxicated he became, I'm not sure what I said, but something set him off and he took a swing at me. Before I knew it, I was on the ground being kicked. The other guys came to a halt long enough for me to get away, and after that night I made sure to keep my distance when someone I didn't know was around. This rule served me well until I allowed myself to be duped by someone I thought I knew. The second incident is what ultimately led to me getting my own apartment sooner than I had planned. My memory of the incident with Tampa was fading. Other, more pressing concerns, such as staying warm and fed, were preoccupying the majority of my thoughts. Despite being a homeless teenager, I managed to get a promotion at work. I may have led them to believe that I dropped out of school to devote more time to my work. They're either true or false. The raise came with the promotion. I've been spending most of my money just to stay alive. Now living would be a lot easier, and I was gathering wood one Saturday when I noticed a guy about my age walking toward me with a backpack. Although leery, he seemed normal enough to me. He had just returned from Kansas City. I forgot to ask which one, and he told me his name was Dallas. We started talking, and I told him about the camp. He thanked me before we parted ways. Later that night, as a bottle made its way among us, we continued our conversation around the fire. For the next 2 days, I spent my evenings with Dallas and the rest of the guys, listening to their incredible stories of riding the rails. Everything appeared to be fine until that second evening. I had made a mistake earlier that day when I mentioned it was payday. I'd always been secretive about my earnings. A few of the guys knew I had a steady job. Even with them, I never let them see me with more than a few dollars. I've had caches where I'd hide the majority of my money since I was a kid. I made sure to move it at irregular times and intervals because being paranoid was preferable to being robbed. Dallas and I were talking about something personal that evening. I hadn't taken the time to stash my money before leaving camp, and Dallas seemed to have noticed. When he couldn't find my current cash, I realized he'd been spending his days looking for it. He probably assumed I had it on me. During our discussion, he inquired about borrowing money. I told him I'd given everything I had to pay for the bottle. He just called me a liar and pulled out a long pocket knife. I was obviously terrified. Nonetheless, I lost nearly $1,000. I must have been more terrified. I clung to the lie for as long as I could, but fear overcame me, and I began begging. His expression had shifted to one of pure evil. I knew he had no qualms about murdering me. My flight response kicked in and I was about to run when Dallas took a wide swipe at me. I was out of range for the cut to be too severe, but I was slashed across my left arm nonetheless. I was too scared to turn away at this point, but I knew I couldn't stay where I was. I started jogging backward up the hill, keeping an eye on Dallas the whole time. I took about 5 steps and watched him fold up and collapse. It didn't make sense until I saw the shape of another person standing behind him, holding something long. I called out, and one of the regulars, Johnny, stepped into the dim light. Johnny was wielding his signature axe handle. I thanked him, and he proceeded to tell me that he and a few others had been watching Dallas all evening while in the liquor store. Dallas had made a casual remark about me being Mr. Moneybags. He assumed Dallas had something in mind. Dallas was starting to stir and curse Johnny, and Johnny simply looked down at him and said get, adding that if he didn't, he'd get an even worse beating. Dallas did as he was told and vanished into the night. Hopefully for the sake of safety. I spent that night and the next few at the hobo camp. For the rest of the week, I made an effort to take a different route to and from work. I never saw Dallas again. My second assault in less than a year, however, was too much for me. I'd had enough of looking for a place by this point. I had hoped for a little more, but that seems to be the case in life, right? That weekend, I spent at the library going through Craigslist classifieds. And by late Sunday evening, I was fast asleep in my own apartment. It was a small dump, but it was mine. I found a better, more permanent job a few months later and stayed for 3 years. I still think about Johnny and the other guys now and then. There was nothing like you'd expect from people in that life. But even being surrounded by a group of good guys like that while camping, or sleeping rough as some call it, is an experience. I would not recommend it to anyone. The story is set in the summer of 2004. For the past few years, I've been hiking the trails of a nearby state park. The hour-long drive to the park went as well as it could have before I parked near the ranger station and informed him of my plans. After one last check of my pack, I began my 2-mile hike to my usual campsite. Little did I know at the time that one person's life had just taken a tragic turn, and that I would soon pursue my interest in the outdoors. Started shortly after the September 11th attacks, despite not being personally present at any of the attack targets. I did lose someone very close to me, and while we had been college sweethearts but had lost touch, the internet allowed us to reconnect. We had planned to meet for Thanksgiving and had been talking about renewing our relationship. I was devastated by the news and immediately began planning my own demise. I got as far as packing my belongings and hiking out to the location. But something happened when I arrived. The beauty of the place overcame me. Regardless of the other grief I was experiencing, the peace I discovered on that mountain changed my mind. My grieving process would last some time. At no point did I feel overwhelmed. I ran back into nature, which always made things bearable again. So we've returned to the summer of 2004. My retreats had become a habit by this point. Nothing noteworthy happened that first evening, so the next day I weighed my options and decided to hike down into the canyons. These excursions frequently resulted in the acquisition of a few stone points for my ever-expanding collection. I downed some oatmeal and started down the cliffside trail when a glint of light caught my eye. I couldn't find the source. Another flash soon blinded me. I quickly recovered and noticed a pair of flailing arms about 50 feet down the cliffside. I jogged down the trail to get a better look. I jumped onto a rocky outcropping off to the side. I could feel it giving way beneath my feet almost immediately. The fall seemed to last an eternity. I gritted my teeth in anticipation of excruciating pain, but it wasn't as bad as I'd feared. When I looked back from the flat of my back, I realized I had only gone about 20 feet. I lay there for a few moments, trying to remember what had brought me here. When I tried to stand, I discovered my left foot was wedged between two large rocks. I pushed against the top rock while simultaneously pulling my leg. I had just enough room to wiggle my leg free. I stood up and looked around for the rest of the person I'd seen. Off to my right, I noticed a woman who was almost motionless. I carefully stepped down the cliffside until I reached her, and she appeared to be dead at first, but her lips began to move. I knelt beside her and began speaking calmly. I inquired as to her name. Her eyes gradually opened, and a smile spread across her face. When I saw that rock collapse, I assumed you were dead. A scratchy but kind voice spoke to me. I'm not trying to be impolite, but you don't happen to have any water, do you? I quickly searched my pack for my Nalgene. Slowly and carefully, the bottle was dented but showed no leaks. I put the opening to her lips and poured a small amount into her mouth. I was afraid she'd vomit if I gave her too much at once. We talked for a few minutes about how she ended up there. I would occasionally fill her mouth with more water. She was obviously in a lot of pain, and I knew the longer I talked, the further she was from medical help. I informed her of my plan, and wrapped her in the fleece from my pack. Climbing back up the loose rocky hill was more difficult than going down. I was starting to feel a lot of pain myself, particularly in my back. I tried a hobbling run at first, but my knees wouldn't let me. Instead, I chose to walk quickly. The journey was long and difficult, but I arrived at the ranger's post shortly after 12:45 p.m. To his credit, he quickly assembled a rescue team. I had to make do with an ambulance ride and an overnight hospital stay. I think it was around 6 o'clock when I saw the staff rolling her in, and the wait was far from over. Unfortunately, she had been taken into emergency surgery shortly after arriving, and it would be several hours before I heard anything. Despite having a punctured lung, a concussion, a broken arm, and various other injuries, the news was good. She would go on to recover completely. My healing journey is a story for another time. Shannon, on the other hand, was her name. She was reunited with her loving family and went on to start her own. Last I learned, she lived in Colorado with her husband and 3 sons, and I hope everyone joins me in wishing her a long and happy life. I'm just glad I could be there to help her through everything she went through when I was a kid. I had always wished to be a Boy Scout. And it was still a respected group teaching useful outdoor skills at the time. I think I was 10 when I finally persuaded my mother to let me join. She was initially hesitant because she had grown up in Russia. Scouting groups were essentially military training for children. I asked the Den mother to speak with my mother, and after a series of questions, her fears were allayed. With that one hurdle removed, I became a Cub Scout. Unfortunately, I quickly discovered that scouting in my area was not what it was cracked up to be. Our Den mother was a neurotic single mother with little motivation. It was a huge disappointment for me. 6 months later, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon. A scout leader from another county invited our Den to join us on a camping trip. This was a major motivator for me to join. I used to enjoy camping with my family, but since my parents divorced, all of those trips had come to an end. The scout leader picked us up early on a Saturday morning, and drove us all to the campsite. There were only about 9 children present. He gathered us all and instructed us on how to pitch our tents. The leader showed us where to go and we began pitching if you needed help, but the experience went smoothly. The rest of the morning was spent primarily on first aid and general safety. I was paired with a leader and thus served as a visual aid. I was wrapped in bandages and carried on a makeshift litter for the next few hours. It was enjoyable and useful in the circumstances that arose. First aid was completed, lunch was prepared, and we were all allowed to take a short nap. This lasted until about 3 o'clock, when we were all gathered for archery lessons, and I was beyond excited. I'd wanted to shoot a bow ever since I saw my first ninja movie. This is my one and only chance for a long time. The leader gave us a quick lesson on how to shoot. It was obviously very insistent on safety, but you can imagine that a bunch of hyped-up preteen boys weren't paying much attention to that part. As I drew back the string, I was the first to shoot. I recall squatting down like a ninja. I was chastised and told to stand up straight. This made the experience less thrilling. However, seeing the arrow hit where I had been aiming was exhilarating, and the rest of the boys won and turned to chase me down. Were we only allowed to shoot on our own after that? Everyone was chatting away, trying to outshoot the kid next to him, when it happened. Kevin, the kid next to him, was talking to Chris, the kid next to him. Kevin had the arrow knocked and the string about a quarter of the way back. Kevin must have let go of the string or lied his way out of it when Chris said something that caused Kevin to turn toward him. Later. In any case, the arrow struck Chris in the chest and penetrated about 8 inches. Panic ensued, and the scout leader started yelling for first aid supplies. Chris was panicking and having difficulty breathing. There wasn't much the scout leader could do except pack the wound and try to keep Chris calm. 2 boys were tasked with running the half-mile to the ranger station, while the rest of us stood around and stared. I'll accept Kevin's apology as he paced around the room. The ambulance arrived about 20 minutes later after the scout leader told him to stop talking. It was probably the longest 20 minutes of my life. And that was the end of the journey. Everyone hurriedly packed their belongings, and we all returned home during the ride home. The gravity of the situation had to have hit Kevin hard. I can still hear his agonizing wailing to this day. It was, in my opinion, nothing more than a terrible accident. Others, on the other hand, recall events differently. According to one boy, Chris had called Kevin a name no boy our age wanted to be called, and Kevin shot him for it. Only Kevin knows the truth, and he's never spoken to anyone about it. News of Chris's condition didn't reach me until the following morning. He had been rushed into surgery and it had gone well. The arrow had punctured Chris' left lung, just missing his heart by an inch. He did manage a full recovery. Kevin was probably the happiest to hear this news. All involved agreed it had been an unfortunate accident and no charges were brought against him. And a few months later, the 2 boys had a meeting in which Kevin formally apologized to Chris, and from what I hear Chris did accept. As far as I know, he's never had a grudge. Not even I got away completely unscathed the second my mom heard about that incident. My scouting days were over. I wasn't too disappointed though. Instead, I got into BMX, and I guess that turned out to be a far safer experience. Hey friends. Thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. Thanks so much friends, and I'll see you again soon.